Okay, before everybody disappears, how are you? Are you surviving? This is what we call in English the graveyard slot. I'm the guy between you and your dinner, between you and going home to your wife or your husband, or having a relaxing swim in the swimming pool. So blame me, okay? When he read my name out and he said I work for the Danish Technological Institute, that is true. But I'm one of these guys with what I call a portfolio of work. I work for Professor Wakarodi from Brunel. He doesn't pay me much, but I like him, so I work for him. Okay? I also work for the Open University in the UK, so I have an educational interest as well, directly. I'm an online counselor and teacher. You know, the Open University of the UK was founded in 1968, the first open university in the world, and I was there from the beginning. I'm an old guy, you can see. I also have my own company. I have lots of jobs. Now, I'm telling you this not to boast, because in some ways it's a problem, but because this is what's happening in the economy, right? And this is what education has to take account of. We're no longer educating, by and large, for people who take a job when they leave school or university and then have the same job for the rest of their lives. That was the case maybe in the early part of my life, but no longer the case. My son, who's now 30, he also has a portfolio of work. He's got a part-time games design company. He's a registered designer of games for Apple, and he actually develops games for young children to learn languages and other things, right? He also works for a company a couple of days a week, and to tell you the truth, I'm not sure what he does the rest of the time, but he earns enough money, right? And this guy's only 30, okay? So education has a huge challenge. Education is not the same as it was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. This is something I want to talk a little bit about, right? But this is obviously mainly a European perspective. I've been to Brazil once before, but that was briefly 10 years ago. I went to Rio, and I was mainly on Copacabana Beach, so I didn't see much else, okay, at that time. But I think Brazil is also on this wave of new types of education coming through. Education is critical, of course, right? And I'm going to try to address this directly, because I guess most of you are in education. Hands up people who are in education, work in education in some form or other. Okay, quite a few, yeah? So what I'm going to talk about is mainly for you, but because you are in education, it probably means you know it all. Let's see. I'm not going to talk for long, because I know you want to get back to your wife or your husband or a swimming pool, okay? And time is getting on. But lots of things are happening. One of the things is student-centered learning. The other one is online learning. Okay, before we get into all that stuff, why are we doing education? There's lots of reasons. But one of the reasons is that we have huge, what the United Nations calls wicked problems. They're wicked because they're ultimately unsolvable. And they're very, very complex. That's why you get confused and you need a lot of good luck and you get baffled and you get lost. But education is the only way we can solve some of these problems. Obviously with cooperation as well. But cooperation between people who are educated and have the will to try to solve these problems. That's the only way we're going to get out the climate change mess, sustainability mess, unemployment, lack of skills, problems with biodiversity, all sorts of problems. I won't read them, but you can see some of them there. The aging society, we have a huge problem in Europe. I guess not so much here in Brazil, but we have a huge problem. In about 10 years' time, 1/3 of the population will be retired. Just think of it, right? So we need huge increases in efficiency just to keep people's living standards the same. No? And education is one of the main inputs to that. I do a lot of work for the UN. Okay, I work for the European Commission. I help design some of their future research programs in the e-government. I also work for the UN on designing some of these goals here and designing e-government at the global level. But you know, this year is a very, very important year because it's the end of the Millennium Development Goals. And there were 8 Millennium Development Goals started in the year 2000, and they run out this year. And you can see that there's 8 of them, and one of them was about education. It's about achieving universal primary education. So the focus 15 years ago, in the last 15 years, was on primary education, making sure everybody got an education. And you can see there, this is a status taken at the end of last year from the UN's website. There's a statistical website you can go to. And you can see there that ensure all children can complete primary school. We're only up at the moment at 91%. That's not too bad, but we've still got a long way to go by this year. Not going to happen. Gender equality and gender disparities in schools, that's actually almost achieved, so it's been marked green, okay? So there's still some things to do. So the MDGs have been a bit of a mixture. Some good things and some bad things. What's going to, whoops. If you ask ordinary people, and you can go online and vote, worldwewant2015.org, you can go online and vote. If you look on the left-hand side, you see a good education comes number 1. Education matters. People the world over want education. Number 2 is health. And number 3, which is also what we're talking about today, an honest and responsive government. Okay? That's interesting. Yeah? If you go back 20 years, people wouldn't have said that so much. But people realize more and more globally, this is a global thing, around the world, that good governance in the context of health and education are critical for solving some of these wicked problems. You look, this pattern repeats itself across male, female, under 34 to 54, low income, medium income, high income, very high. The only exception is the over 55s, where they put health number 1. I guess for obvious reasons, right? I'm over 55, but I still think education is the most important thing, right? But that's actually quite interesting. There's a unanimous global move that education is really important. So you're in the right business. We're in the right business too. I mean, I only spend half a day a week doing education, actually, but this is what's going to replace the MDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And the big change is the focus is on sustainability, right? And sustainability, if you know, in the UN context, is 3 pillars. Social sustainability, cohesive, socially cohesive societies, which also include everybody and which don't have too much inequality. Economic sustainability, where people can have jobs and there's good skills and people have enough access to finance to have a reasonably good life. And of course, environmental sustainability, where we don't destroy the environment and destroy the earth and destroy our basis for living on this planet, of course. So those 3 things are very important. At the moment, there are 17 goals. Remember, there were just 8 in the previous goals, and there are 17 now. Now, some people think that's a problem. I think actually it's a bit of a problem. I was in the UN last week in New York, discussing this with people there, and it's almost certain that those 17 will stay. There's lots of people who want to reduce it, but there's so many vested interests in each of them to keep them. So I think it's going to stay, and that may give problems. But the interesting thing, you look at goal number 4, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning. The previous education goal was about primary education, and that was, I think, that was necessary at that time. The new one is education in general, but lifelong learning, and that's one of the new focuses. I'm sure you're aware of that in terms of education. What is education? This is a European perspective, maybe by and large, but there's a big article in the Guardian newspaper just a couple of weeks ago. Hardly anything matters more than education. And I think looking at the way the world has voted, I think that's quite true. Education is about transferring ideas, ways of thinking, cultures from one generation to the next. Okay? That's one definition of education. Social reproduction. so that our children carry some of the things that we want them to learn about our culture and our language and the way we think about the world and our norms and our values. Transmission between generations. But there's other types of education. Any experience which is formative, affects your character, the way you think, the things you do, the skills and the competencies you have. That's also a type of education. So all formative experiences contribute to education, in this definition. Education can be different things as well. It can be formal, like in a school or university, we have a curriculum and you have a set of qualifications at the end. It can also be non-formal, which it doesn't have a set of qualifications or curriculum, but it's actually quite structured, like learning to play sports or learning about a particular hobby or something like that. That's what we call non-formal education. These are the three classic OECD distinctions about what education is. There's also informal. You know, whenever you want to learn something, you want to read up a bit of history, you want to do something on your own or with some friends. There's no real structure to it, you're just informally feeling your way ahead. That's also a form of education, of course, okay? Most of you are engaged in formal education, obviously, but we need to recognize these other types of education, I think you agree, because they haven't been recognized much before, and that's one of the big changes, I think. Okay, and education frequently takes place under the guidance of others. Guided education. That's, again, what we do in schools and universities by and large, and many of you are doing that. But education can also be learning together, peer education. I get together with some of my peers to learn something or do something. That's a form of education. But also, increasingly, you can do it on your own. You know, you can Google something and you can say, I'm really interested in the planning of Brasilia and how Niemeyer and the other guys, and women probably, who developed Brasilia, got going on this. I knew I was coming to Brasilia, so I thought I'd look it up, okay? I was educating myself about Brazil and Brasilia before I came. And that's added to my knowledge. That's an education which I've done myself. And I think that's also legitimate. But what is education for? This is probably a classic question which people often don't ask themselves. But on the one hand, there's a historic tension, I think, and it's changing. If you go back 20, 30 years, when I was first working for the Open University, actually it started in 1969. It's a long, long time ago, before many of you were born, I guess. You know, the education was about reproducing society. The reproduction of society, that was the sociological term we used. It's how getting individuals to conform to society's values, socialization and culture, inculturation, so they can live peacefully and get work which is available. It's about societal cohesion, harmony, stability, and continuity. That's important, right? Of course it is. We can't live in a society that doesn't have those things. Or we need some elements of those things. But there's a new type of education coming along. How do we renew society? Education is about renewing society. If we're going to tackle these wicked problems successfully, we want to be able to renew the way we do things. It's talking about change and development, creativity, and there's lots of new jobs coming along. We need to be able to address and overturn unfairness and injustice. And I know you've got big problems about that in Brazil right now, but we have similar problems in Europe, you know, don't doubt about it, you know. We need education to help us do that. Give us the tools as individuals, as communities, to actually address some of these issues in societies. Because we can't just let politicians decide anymore, or the big companies anymore, because, you know, we've given them the chance and they haven't always succeeded. So it's about innovation and progress, less inequality maybe, if that's what you think, more inclusion, increasing prosperity and welfare. So not standing still. But many people would say that's the most important. It probably is, my view, but you need both. And this is relevant also to the public sector, you know. People often say the public sector, especially using IT, should be just like a business. Agile, nimble, very innovative, changing all the time. Of course, we need some elements of that. But the public sector is not the same as a big private company, right? Because the public sector has to serve everybody. It has to provide elements of stability and continuity. But otherwise, people have disrupted lives. And even businesses need to know that the rules and regulations aren't going to change every week because they want to be able to invest. So you need a balance. These two things need to be in balance, of course, right? In the past, it's been too much at the top, in my view. But this is debatable. You may have other views. And now there's a lot of new stuff coming forward. We need to educate for innovation, educate for change. You know, thinking about new types of jobs in the innovative industries, in the creative industries, you know. But we do need a balance, I think, in the education system. That's my view. I don't know what you think, but we can discuss that maybe. There's also a tension in the education sector between the old types of doing education, where people meet in a classroom, the teacher stands at the front and tells them what to do and what to think. You know, that cartoon on the right tells it all. Education is about stuffing knowledge and skills and understanding into children's heads or into anybody's heads, because the teacher knows best and you are an empty vessel receiving knowledge, right? That's the classic view. But the new view is more varied than that. Many new firms now, social entrepreneurs, civil society organizations, are allowing individuals to have more autonomy, to work in teams, to decide themselves, to address and solve problems on their own, rather than being told what to do. So we need to educate, or education is part of that process. It reflects this new, flatter, growing, creative, collaborative and sharing economy. Because a lot of the economy, certainly in Europe, is now around collaboration and sharing. You know, this is the sharing economy where you share assets. The sharing economy is actually, I'm sure you've heard of it in Brazil, but in California, for example, where it started, it's now 25% of the economy in California. Don't forget, California is the 8th biggest country in the world, if it was a country. It's huge, right? Right? And 25% of their economy is about sharing. People share cars. People share accommodation. Businesses share resources with each other. Governments share resources with each other. Okay? Some of the first companies growing out of Silicon Valley in California on the sharing economy, one called Zipcar, where you shared cars, is now a huge multi-billion-dollar business around the world. Right? And the other one, Airbnb, if you've heard of that, where you pay to sleep on someone's spare room. Right? Anybody a member of Airbnb here, apart from me? Okay, next time I come, I'll see if I can. Okay, that is also a multi-million dollar industry now, right? It's amazing because you have an asset which you're not using. You may as well turn it into a bit of money. But it's not just about the money. Of course, you meet people, new people, get new experiences. And the people who go and live in your room somewhere, probably not in the center in a large hotel, in a suburb somewhere else. So you're bringing your custom to another part of town, right? And the hotels hate it. Of course they do. They're trying to stop it because it's undermining their business plan, their business model, right? Of course. But this is getting bigger and bigger in Europe. In the UK now, although the data is a bit contested, I think 3 years ago, the sharing economy was worth £15 billion a year, right? According to some estimates. So it's getting huge. Yeah? And we need to educate people for these sorts of things. Yeah? I won't read this out because I'm going to unpick some of these things as I go through here. But we're talking now about how IT is changing this. This idea of the sharing economy I just talked about, in some ways it's nothing new. People have always shared a car to go to work. People have always shared their house with other people, occasionally. But it's always been a minority, small minority, because you normally had to know people personally beforehand. The big dramatic change is the internet and IT. You can now have an app, you can go online. When I go to Paris, which I went a couple of weeks ago, I can actually book a room somewhere with someone I've never seen, and I know that in real time that it's available. I know what the price will be. That was impossible before IT came along. So IT is not necessarily doing anything new, but it is doing something new because it's a game changer. It's massively scaling what's already going on. And it's thereby changing the relationships between people and changing the economy and changing the society. And education needs to serve that purpose to some extent, right? So the new jobs coming through are not the same as the jobs of my father's generation, or even when I was first going into work. Things are changing dramatically. Let's have a look at what ICT does to education. Again, this is my personal view, and you may disagree completely, but anywhere, anytime education. You can actually access online learning, of course, whenever you want, wherever you are, okay? And you can decide how you use it and what it is. Once you're connected, the costs go to zero. That's an important point, because my son, I've got another son, who's reading biotech at Copenhagen University. He wanted to learn about how to write English science articles, although he's very, very good at English, because I always spoke English to him. So he went online and got an online course from Stanford University in the US about science writing. It was a 6-week course. He paid virtually nothing for it. The reason is because it's zero cost to Stanford. Once they've set the course up and the relationship up, it doesn't cost a thing, because Stanford University are not providing a qualification. What is providing the qualification? Peer assessment. So what happens is, when he writes an essay or writes a science report, 2 or 3 other students on the same course at the same time, anonymously, give him feedback and assess it. And he does the same for other people. That's a very, very powerful new form of accreditation or qualification. It has its pitfalls, of course, but you could argue the present system does as well. Okay? This is happening all the time, right? And the cost to Stanford, once they set that up, is virtually zero. It runs itself. Yeah? They maybe have to manage it occasionally. You know? So in many of these things, the costs are going to zero. Yeah? In other things, they're not, and we'll come back to that maybe. But Web 2, you know, the social media allows interaction, dialogue, and content creation in real time with anybody in the world. That's new, of course, as well, for the last 5 to 10 years. And we went from correspondence schools, these distance education schools, where people sent in essays by the post and they got comments back, maybe a phone call. We're now gone, that's all gone, by and large. It's all online. When I worked for the Open University, I started in '69, that's what we were doing, basically. And now it's all online, right? I supervise real-time online discussions amongst the students, and I'm actually just prodding them. They're doing most of the work, right? And I mark their essays and things like that online, give them real-time feedback, and I can Skype with them and all sorts of things. So the university is now fully open 24/7, 365, in effect, right? That's a huge change in education. And if you do it through a proper university, like the Open University in the UK, and this has gone all around the world now, the qualification you get is just as good as anywhere else, right? I would argue. But that's a big issue we'll come back to. Learning analytics, because a lot of this stuff is taking place online, and the universities or the other education providers know a lot about you, and there's millions of you, they start collecting data about you. And you can analyze that data. Just like, what's it called? Facebook analyzes the data about you when you're active online, right? The educational providers can do the same. So, and that's good in some ways, because it means that they can understand where the demand is, where you are, what sort of person you are, what sort of times of the day and night or days of the week you're working. And they can actually, on that basis, using data analytics, they can actually work out what sort of educational materials you need and when to offer them and how to offer them. It's a huge change. There are dangers in that, of course, which people can misuse the data, but again, we'll come back to that. Crowd learning and citizen inquiry. You know, the wisdom of the crowd. Has anybody read that book? About 6 or 7 years ago? Where if you actually get a large number of people in the crowd, and again, it's nothing new, but it's massively improved now by the internet. Yeah? If you put a question out there on some forum, or if you're in a science network, you could almost instantly get a lot of good answers back, and you can solve your problem. That wasn't possible before. Okay? Crowd learning became very, very important. You can get content, expertise, opinions, and feedback from other people, often your peers, of course. This also, I think, interesting, the blurring of roles. Anybody can be a teacher in this context. Anybody can be a learner. Anybody can be an intermediary. I mean, someone who's organizing or providing an educational system. Again, these things are quite new. In the past, the roles of teacher and student, or teacher and pupil, were very separate. Right? Now, when I'm teaching my Open University courses, it's often not me teaching. It's often the other students helping the others and teaching themselves, right? So the role of teacher in many of these situations, and I'm sure you've experienced this yourself in higher education, is much more of a facilitator and a mediator, making sure they're going in the right direction, being an advisor, an arbitrator, rather than always being the direct teacher. I mean, that also has to happen, of course, especially if you have a curriculum. But often, if the students can do it themselves and with their peers, that's actually much more effective. Getting them involved, of course, means that they own it, and they understand it better, and they learn it much better. It's a bit about psychology in there as well. So this is another way that education is changing, and it's always been there, but in the past it was very small, and you had to be physically together. Now all this stuff can take place online. Also, citizen inquiry, mass participation in structured large-scale investigations, asking people questions about what they think the government should do, for example. That's a form of education, but more directly, this so-called citizen science, if you heard of that. I'm actually part of a citizen science project trying to identify types of galaxy. You know, it's amazing. There's so many millions of galaxies that the people are now photographing now. They've discovered that people just looking at a galaxy is better than a computer can categorize them. So they ask all these people who sign up, they give their time free, actually classify these galaxies to find out what sort of galaxies they are, whether they're spirals or whether they're long spirals with a long tail, or they're not spirals at all. There's all sorts of different types. There's about 8 basic types we use, okay? And I learned a lot from that. And you couldn't do this in the old days before the internet, of course. Right? That's also an education, if you like. Gamification. As I said, my son is an authorized Apple games designer, but he designed stuff for the Danish school system, games to help children in primary school learn languages, right? Very simple games on iPads, things like that. And it's amazing what you can do with that. The children are to some extent in control of themselves, and they're often the teachers in the background, but they like it. It's fun. It's engaging. It's challenging. They get rewards. Not money, of course, but they get points and things like you do in games. And that can be part of the educational process, of course. It can be very enriching. It's also got a lot of money in it as well, if you're in the right business. And there's also what we call tangible computing, which is quite a new thing, using the Internet of Things, where sensors and other electronic devices are embedded in physical things. And we're starting to do experiments now in Denmark and probably in the UK, where handicapped people, they can perhaps just use their fingers and they can manipulate objects and learn about physical things and other things in their environment, right? Which is again, quite new. 3 major trends resulting from some of this. How am I doing for time? I think we're okay, just about. Access is exploding, of course. Access to education. Yeah? Universal access and equity in education, in principle. Well, we're not there yet, but that's what's happening. Availability of quality learning materials and courses globally. Teachers' professional development globally, in principle, right? If you want to do it. But also the scope of education is changing. Yeah? We're no longer thinking of, like, when I was first started at the Open University in '69, we had a pedagogy unit, and most of the thinking there was after Piaget. If you know anything about educational psychology, Piaget was this guy who said, you know, you have to educate the children once they get to a certain age, 18, 19, 20. That was the education finish. They were fixed for life. They could go out and do a job. All you had to do after that, as an adult, you just give them some more facts. But basically, there was a maturity idea, right? That's all gone. We now understand that people learn all their life long, whether it's formal or informal or whatever it is, right? And that's new. It's 20, 25 years ago, right? But new compared with 30, 40 years ago. So Piaget is out the window. He's still got some interesting things to say about children's education. But this idea that you become mature educationally at the end of childhood. But that means that we're now focusing on what we call lifelong education. You're learning all the time. It could be vocational learning, of course, to get a job. But it's also learning for life, right? That's why we talk about life-wide education. Everything you do with your social life and your economic life and your hobbies and your interests, learning how to be a citizen, they're all forms, in a sense, of education. Now, I may be spreading the definition too wide. That's up to you to decide, right? But arguably, they're all forms of education. And in Europe, we do research on these things and roll out projects, mainly on lifelong, but also life-wide education. Because it can, the sort of person you are and the citizen you are affects the way you work in the economy. And whether you're a good citizen, whether you participate in democratic life, all sorts of issues, right? So these are legitimate concepts that need investigation anyway, even if we find that they're a bit empty, maybe. So that's changing. Personalized education. This is one of my favorite quotes ever, and you think it's probably very mundane. People don't want choice, because we know we've had choice rammed down our throats in the last 10, 20 years. People want choice. The private sector gives them choice. Government should give people choice. But normally the choice is a few mundane things. People want exactly what they want. It's personal. And that applies to education. Right? Now, often they don't know exactly what they want, and that means you have to have a dialogue with them. Right? Of course. And you can reach some sort of consensus, but that is always changing. So understanding that people are individuals, even if they're doing a common curriculum and have to get a recognized degree, a master's or a PhD, those things are important. Right? People are different, and they want different things. And the route they take is often different as well. And you can do this for the first time using IT. It wasn't really possible on a mass scale before IT. It means you have to have an additional skill set. In the past, even at the university, you were spoon-fed. Yeah? The lecturer told you what to do, what books to read, etc. Now, it's up to you. Not up completely, but you take the initiative. You have to make sure you have some of the skills. You have to make sure you design your time and planning about education and what you do when, especially if you're doing a part-time course, like at the Open University and as an adult. It's up to you. You have some help. I'm also the Open University counsellor, and that means I help people get those study skills, we call them. Go back 30, 40 years, that was up to the lecturer or the teacher. The students were just receptacles for knowledge. Right? That's all changed now, right? So more responsibility on the individual. Different skill sets, apart from the skill of learning stuff, whether it's public administration, whatever it is. Being an independent learner, responsible for your own, ultimately, education, and responsible for understanding what career opportunities there are, but though you can get help all the way, and you should do, of course, right? That's up to you, right? Of course, we need to help people who can't do that very well, and that's another challenge. But new learning environments, as I think I said before, whatever suits you in your learning, take it with you in the bath or anywhere, right? I know people, some of my students who go and sit on the loo and, you understand that word? And they do their reading on there because it's the only quiet place in the house. If you're a mature adult with a full-time job and you're learning at the Open University or one of your universities, often the only quiet, and the kids are running around, the only quiet place in the house may be the toilet, right? And you can lock the door, you can sit and read. I know people who do this, right? But you can do that because you haven't got to go to a class in the tent. You can read the stuff and you can listen to something. And of course, then there will also be face-to-face tutorials in many cases as well. So blended learning is also important, Special needs learners, handicapped people who've got learning difficulties, they can often have specialized learning environments as well, which we can help design. The last big trend is about multiple partners. In the past, it was the Education Institute, the university, the school, giving you the education. Okay, now, especially with these new forms of education, more personalized education, more informal education, you need a range of actors for material and support, emotional support. The Open University students I teach and coach, they need a lot of emotional support. And I can try to give them that, right? I'm not going to be their student or their psychologist, but they do need to know sometimes, I'm letting my wife and kids down, I'm spending 10 hours a week on this, etc., etc. You can help give them that, often by phone or, whatever. Yeah? And that's a good service that people can give, right? But often, actually, it's not the official tutor or counselor, it's the peer thing. They get a special friend who's doing the same course, and they can help each other emotionally, as well as in terms of educational content, right? And that is a very powerful form of support. but especially if a man or a woman is learning the Open University stuff or any distance education, if their spouse, their wife or their husband is understanding and supports them, that is the critical thing, right? And it needs to be negotiated sometimes if they're spending a lot of time and they've got young kids running around, right? That's often what we found. That's a really, if they can get over that barrier and actually make sure their partner supports them, that makes a huge difference to their success and their enjoyment. Right? But also, you know, the private sector gets involved in education, civil society organizations, local community support groups, often provides facilities. So there's a whole range of partners. And if you use IT, of course, you need technical people to get involved in that. Because although we all say, forget the IT, and we should, because the IT is just a tool, and that actually can do anything today, it still needs to work well. And we've seen a few examples today where it hasn't worked very well. But don't worry, that's the case everywhere. I was in a big conference in New York about 3 months ago, and everything crashed. And IBM was sponsoring it. It was so embarrassing, right? But you do need things to work well, especially when people's time and money as well is being invested. Give you a quick example. I think I've got 5 minutes left, more or less. So I do a lot of work in social innovation. I just finished running a big course, a big project for the European Commission. I'm now involved in another one. This idea that there's new ways of, education is a social need, right? There's new ways often of meeting that need. And we define social innovation, you'll hear more about that on Friday. It's meeting a social need in new ways, so it's innovative. But it also, and this is for me critical, empowers the individual to be an independent learner in this sort of case, right? You're not just shoving stuff into their brains, even if that was ever possible, and I never believed it was, right? But to be an independent learner, in a sense, to have their own skills. So a good social innovation, and you probably heard a lot about that, the UN are doing this now, and the World Bank, it's becoming a big thing, right? You need to actually, it's not just about what you achieve, although that's extremely important. It's actually you're building the capacity, the community or the people involved. That is critical, so they can do it on their own in the end, right? They don't need you, or whatever. I mean, this is a never-ending process, of course. But you're not doing things to people, you're doing things with them or enabling a situation where they can do it themselves. Of course, in the educational context, where you need qualifications and certificates, of course, there are some things which have to be red lines and you have to be insist about, of course, right? If I'm going to have a brain, I get a brain tumor and want someone to operate in my brain, I don't want anybody to do it. I want someone who's a qualified brain surgeon. So there are some things in life where you do need to have proper qualifications that are recognized, of course, right? I'm just doing a big project now where we're looking at social innovation in education. And this is quite new. It's only been published. It's actually not published formally, but it's been finalized in the last week. Globally, there are 4 main areas: improving the formal education sector through infrastructure, teaching materials, getting local communities, getting social entrepreneurs, businesses, people themselves to develop the infrastructures and the teaching materials and the quality and accessibility of education, especially in poor areas around the world. This is quite a lot of social innovations doing that in the education sector. Cross-sectoral cooperation within the education sector, even in Denmark, which is one of the most advanced educational countries in the world. Often the education institutes don't talk to each other. It's crazy. And there's NGOs now who are actually providing these cross-linkings to help people who want to move from one education establishment to another, often not at university level, but at the lower level, right? And you know, these things are important. Cooperation and co-development of lifelong learning with actors outside the formal education system. Because a lot of education today needs to be about what's going on in the real world, right? Because education is not just about improving your mind, although that's also important, and it comes back to our definition. It's also about being able to act in the world purposefully to change things for the better, right? So you need to engage with the communities and people out there in the real world. And often those are sort of other actors which you wouldn't normally think about including in an education process. Many grassroots initiatives as well. My wife works for an NGO, a Danish NGO, works in northern Ghana, rural area, providing education to people who otherwise wouldn't get it, right? Grassroots initiatives, changing the lives of those individuals from the grassroots up, because the central government education system can't reach, they're supposed to, but they can't reach. They haven't got the resources, they haven't got the competence to do it. I'm not saying they're corrupt. Sometimes there is corruption, of course. But they're filling a gap which the public sector can't fill. Right? And that's important as well. What about Latin America? We've actually looked at what's going on in Latin American social innovation. You know, we're working with ECLAC, which I think is the United Nations something or other, based in Chile, I think, and also people in Colombia. We haven't actually got anybody in Brazil yet, but if you want to join in on this, please let me know. Those are the 4 main areas which we've found that is quite general Latin American, Caribbean using social innovation. Adult illiteracy. You know, we had problems with that in Europe to some extent, but I think the problems are greater here. Support for indigenous peoples. Again, you probably, you know, a lot of interesting things happening in that context. And support for rural areas and for persons with disabilities. And also tackling school violence, which surprised me, but I mean, maybe there's a lot of, apparently, social innovation projects with people picked up in that area. I don't know what the background is. I haven't looked at that yet. But this is just, as I say, results off the press almost. If you want to see some of this, let me know, and I'll send it to you, even though it's not formally published, because it's only a first draft, in a sense. But it could be interesting for you. It's quite detailed. Almost finished. Second example, you know what a MOOC is? You do now. It's huge. Massive, open, online courses. What my son was doing in Stanford University as a MOOC. Anywhere in the world you can offer a course, and it could be all types of courses, right? Properly assessed and certified, but maybe not. Maybe peer assessed, as in the case of my son. There's 2 main types at the moment. One is what they call X, designed and managed by organizations, which are often delivering core teaching online with face-to-face, blended learning. And another one, which is the other type, main type at the moment, again, this is changing all the time. It's a dynamic area, what we call C types, focused on community and connections. And a lot of these are happening. Individuals in, you know, academics, or could it be other individuals offering courses, and they could be formal courses, informal courses, with a certificate at the end or not a certificate at the end. You know, there's big quality issues here, which I'll come to in my last slide. But this is expanding dramatically. You look at most universities in the world today, certainly in the West, they're all offering MOOCs. This is massive, right? It's it's driven commercially to a large extent, because you can make money out of it. I mean, my son paid a small amount to Stanford University, but because their costs, as I said, are virtually zero once they've designed it, they're actually raking the money in. I don't mind. Stanford's a good place. You know, I don't mind them doing that. But sometimes these are offered by people who are just in it for the money only, right? And you have to be a bit careful. But the problem is, how can you distinguish sometimes? But the impact of MOOCs already is actually significant reduction in educational costs. As I say, zero marginal cost idea. Widening access to education of all types, the long tail. You probably haven't heard of that famous book, 2006, by Chris Anderson. Basically say, if there are 50 people in the world, scattered, who want a course in something very specialized, before the IT, you couldn't do it. But now, because you can reach those 50 people, and 50 people are enough to make it viable, you can do it. But you couldn't do it before IT. That's the long tail. So the number and variety of courses you can offer is massively increased by the long tail. Once you get enough people to make it worthwhile, whether you're commercial or not commercial, and that globally, you can do it, right? That is new, that's changed. And arguably increases employability. You know, people are more trained and get better qualifications. That's a contention which I think needs testing. But certainly the reduction in costs, I think, has actually already been shown. Okay, what about, I've been saying how great it all is, right? There are problems. This is my penultimate slide. The quality and value for money. There's so many things out there. Information is overloaded. You know, even with sophisticated IT search and sorting things, you've got no idea what's good and what's bad, what there is. So maybe one of the new roles for educators, it's a role actually you have already to some extent, is actually acting as, you know, trusted third parties. People you can go to actually find out in this particular area, or it could be an organization, what is globally, what sort of courses are going to be suitable for me? And are they good courses, right? This is a new type of role coming up where there's going to be huge demand for people to do those sorts of jobs. Certification, right? Big issue. I mean, my son didn't mind too much just getting peer review on his science writing course because it just improved his skills. He hasn't got to prove to an employer that he's got science writing skills in English because he can show them, right? But if you're going to be a brain surgeon or design aeroplanes or whatever, that's an issue. You want a reputable university. How do you become a reputable university, right? There's a big issue there. How do you accredit those universities? How do they certify? You know, if everybody's doing MOOCs, you know, you could be ripped off. And many people are being ripped off. Yeah? Who owns the IPR, intellectual property? If you're crowdsourcing a curriculum and getting a great curriculum, who owns the IPR if it's successful? There are huge issues in there. But use of ICT, something that Vishanth mentioned this morning, digital divide. This is great for people who are IT savvy and have access to the internet. And we know globally there's still, you know, only 50% of people globally have access to the internet. And often it's poor quality internet. Mobile phone is better, but it's not often not smartphones, it's the ordinary phones. You know, we're leaving those people out. Yeah? And of course, Facebook can bite back as well, as we know, right? They're selling you think Facebook's great, and it is great, but they have data on you. You are becoming the product. They sell you, your data, to someone who can offer you advertising and do other things, right? So these are big things we mustn't forget. I mean, these are often quite general problems with IT generally. Finally, two final thoughts, sorry, about education. What I've learned, I think, in looking at this, and I've been working in education for many, many years now, as you know, educational techniques and tools work best when the students and or parents understand when and why they're being used, right? So openness and transparency are very important. Gone are the days, I think, hopefully, although it's still there, where you did things to people and you didn't explain why, you didn't involve them, depending on their age and their ability, of course, right? That's very, very important. Openness, engagement, getting people to own what's going on, dramatically, and there's lots of evidence for this, dramatically improves real educational impact and ability of the students who are going through the process. Yeah? So this transparency, I think, is very important. What about IT? What is it that IT does best? And what is it that people do best? This is actually something which we've been discussing, right? You know, you hear people like even, what's his name, Stephen Hawking, you know, Stephen Hawking, the physicist? He's now saying that with artificial intelligence, we've got to be careful. Within 10 years, we'll all be controlled by robots, right? I don't know whether that's right or not. But let's be a bit more savvy about what IT does best. It's very, very good at data crunching. It's very good at doing things to rules that are written down, normally in software and algorithms, right? It's very, very good at doing what we call handling explicit knowledge, which is knowledge which can be codified in some way, in data or in some sort of format in software, right? But arguably, I don't know, this is open, it's probably not very good at being emotionally involved with somebody, right? You know, if you're a teacher and you want to help emotionally support a student or advise them, would you rather have a real person or would you rather have a machine? You know, and a lot of other things, you know, about advocacy, counselling, decision and policy making, brainstorming, they can all be supported by IT. But ultimately, I think, and again, this may be contentious, people are probably still better at doing those things. And this is very relevant for education, with blending learning. What parts do you do using IT? Basically facts and learning stuff and answering simple questions, like we do in the OU, computer-marked assignments, etc. What parts do you leave to people to assess each other, but also to discuss in dialogue and actually reach a common understanding that way? This is a movable feast. It's changing all the time, of course. But when we're talking about IT and education, we need to think about these things, I think. Okay. If you want to get hold of some of that stuff I've been talking about, let me know on this email address, and I'll send it to you, okay? Thank you very much. Good evening. Yeah?
Alguma questão, alguma pergunta para o nosso convidado? Nós temos já recepcionistas já postos. Alguém? Não? Bom, então, para agradecendo o senhor Jeremy Millard, convidamos, então, o mestre em administração, convidamos de novo o professor Wagner, secretário executivo adjunto do Ministério da Educação. Muito obrigada. Assim, encerramos nossas atividades deste primeiro dia do CIGISP 2015. Lembrando que os nossos trabalhos terão reinício amanhã, às 9 horas, onde teremos a palestra Participação Social e Inovação na Segurança Pública, o caso da Polícia Militar de Minas Gerais. Tenham todos uma boa noite e até amanhã.
Nós tínhamos alguns livros para dar para quem fizesse pergunta e acabamos não motivando para isso, né? Mas eu não queria guardar os livros. Eu não gostaria de guardar os livros, então eu vou perguntar aqui o seguinte: